So let me move on now and introduce our special guest. We at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Public Library have had the pleasure of hosting Jennifer Robson twice before for our Wine and Words author series. Once in 2016 for her book Moonlight Over Paris, and then again in 2019 when she read and discussed her novel The Gown. Jennifer Robson is an academic, earning her undergrad at the University of Western Ontario and a PhD from St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. She has worked in journalism and publishing. She is a self-proclaimed history nerd and now a full-time writer who's just released her 6th novel, Our Darkest Night. Jennifer's books illustrate her passionate love of history, set during and after the 2 world wars. Her characters humanize a past that we may know facts about, but now we can also feel and experience what it may have been like during those tumultuous years. Our Darkest Night is a great example of such bringing to life of history. Thank you for coming and sharing your latest book with us. Friends, it is my pleasure to hand the evening over to Jennifer Robson.
Thank you so much. That's very lovely of you. Yeah, so obviously I wish I were standing in a wonderful winery with a glass of something. I have a very tiny, I realize this is a teeny tiny little bit of wine that we have left in the house that I poured for myself more in. But in lieu of that, thank goodness we have technology, and there are the plus sides, such as not having to wear heels or anything resembling, how should I put it, form-fitting trousers. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I've done this entire book tour wearing track pants. It really does make for a comfortable experience for me as the writer. So what I thought I would do is I want to talk about where the idea for the book came from, the inspiration for it, the real history that actually connected to my family that informed me when I was starting work on the book, and then also show you some of the people and the places that again informed my understanding of the history of World War II in Italy. And so I'll do some screen sharing for a little bit. So I'll disappear for certain moments and you'll see photographs, but you'll still hear my voice. So we'll go back to not long after I visited the library. I guess that was the fall of 2019. And I was, or actually, no, sorry, it would have been even earlier. It was the fall of 2018. And I was working, I was awaiting the publication of The Gown, and I was supposed to be working, and in fact, fairly far along in the process of writing my follow-up book. And that book it was not engaging me. It was set in Golden Age Hollywood, which I still maintain is a fascinating period. And it took some secondary characters from Goodnight from London, and I sent them to the United States, and I had it plotted out and I had an idea of the characters and I was all set to write, and it was not engaging me. The characters weren't talking to me at all. I just didn't have any clear sense of them. They weren't people I felt I wanted to know more about, which is a terrible, terrible sign, because if I don't want to know more about them, how can I be sure that readers will? And so I was struggling with that. And at that stage, it was about December 2018. The Gown was coming out. So I had all of that kind of preoccupying me. But at the same time, I was also supposed to be working on this other book. And it was at that point that my son, who is now almost 17, but he was in grade 9 at the time, they were studying World War II history at school. And he came to me. And in fact, we had the conversation in the room I'm now sitting in. At the other end of this, it's actually quite a tiny little room that's my study, is my desk with my computer and so on. And I remember him coming into the room and saying, Mom, the stories about Nona's family from the war, are they true? And I will tell you about the stories in a second, but my honest answer was, I don't know. I can't tell you for sure. I think they're true. I want to believe they're true, but I don't know. And so I offered, I said, I think, but I want to be able to find out and let you know. So just give me a bit of time and I'll look. what he was referring to was the very kind of unexpected discovery that Claudio, my husband, and I had made in 2016 when we were visiting Italy for his 50th birthday. And so we visited Venice and spent some time with his family, and before moving on to France. And it was the first time in years that we had been to see his family there, and we were doing anybody who has, when you visit family abroad or even on the other side of the country, you have to visit everyone. You can't leave one of the cousins or one of the aunts or uncles out because you'll hurt their feelings, right? And so we were going from house to house, and I remember being very, very fueled up on espresso at this stage. I love coffee, but I really just have one per morning. I just don't have the Italian constitution to absorb like a lot of caffeine. And I think I was on my seventh cup of espresso because each house, right, you'd be asked, "Oh, do you want some espresso?" And I'd be sure. Then I'd have my little shot and think, "Oh," just like I plugged my finger into a wall socket. And so Zia Maria, this is his mother's she had three sisters, and so the sister who's next, kind of youngest to her, we were visiting her, and she was sharp as a tack and living independently in her late 80s, and had made just the most delicious coffee for us. And we were talking with her. I'm the kind of person who always wants to talk to people about if they were alive during the war. I love hearing stories. I love hearing stories about people's childhood, what it was like when they're kids, all of that, because especially if they're family members, that's fuel for me to fill in the blanks for my children, for their own family stories. And so I should add too, I never lead with, "Can you tell me about life during the war?" Which is almost a guarantee to stifle all conversation, because you really, until you start digging, you don't know what kind of a war someone had, if it was tremendously traumatic. And I don't really want to be poking fingers into, like, how should I put it? My husband says it's like you're squeezing lemon juice over paper cuts, right? Like, why would you do something, especially to an elderly relative? But there are ways of easing into the conversation and assessing as you go. Is this something people genuinely want to talk about? Are they comfortable with it? So we had eased our way into the conversation just by asking questions about what life was like when she was a little girl. My mother-in-law was still alive at that point, but was not well. And we weren't able to ask her questions about her childhood any longer. So I thought, well, we'll talk to Zia Maria. And so we were asking her questions about her childhood, and then it progressed kind of slowly to the war. I should also add that this was all happening in Italian and dialect, which I do not speak. I can understand dialect, and I can say yes and no and thank you for whatever food is being put in front of me, and I can answer questions about my children's health and the weather, things like that. But I can't have a really complicated conversation. And so that was up to my husband. So he was translating back and forth. And so we did move to questions of what it was like in the war, how hard it was. The part of Italy they're from is in the north, in the Veneto, the same province that Venice is in. They're about 70 kilometers outside Venice to the northwest, very close to a famous mountain called Monte Grappa, which was the site of a number of significant skirmishes and battles, both in the First World War and the Second World War. And it's a beautiful spot. Today, it's lovely. I mean, it's not the kind of place that tourists visit, but it's a beautiful little, very small town that shows no sign of having been, in the midst of a battleground 75 years ago. Um, and so we were asking her what it was like, and predictably, life was really very difficult during the war. They had very little to eat. There were bombings. The Gestapo were everywhere. There were local fascists. There were the partisans who were coming and going. They were really in the teeth of things. And then, almost out of nowhere, I mean, it was just not something that we expected at all. She said, well, the word that I caught initially out of the stream of Italian that I was partially able to follow, but the word that I caught was ebre, which in Italian means, depending on the context, either Jewish or Jew. And that was not something I expected her to say. She was a little girl growing up in this remote village. It just stopped me short. And so, and I was saying to my husband, what is it? And he was doing the waving back. I'm getting it. I'm getting it. Stop pestering me. And what came out of Zia next was the words which I did kind of manage to pick out were the words tonono i gasconti, which means your nono. So that was her father, my husband's grandfather. Tonono i gasconti, he hid them. And I remember just looking at Claudia, we both had identical expressions of, because that was not a story we had ever heard, ever. And he would, mind you, he was 50. And when we checked with his sister, she hadn't heard it. None of the cousins our age knew anything about this. We were completely bowled over. And but then when we started talking with another one of the aunts who's significantly younger, she in fact was born after the war. She said, "Oh yeah, no. My dad, they were like the priest asked him to take people in, and he took people in to hide them from the Nazis." And she was like, it was just a matter of fact thing. Oh yeah, no, that happened. And I remember we were looking at her like, and why has this never come up in ever? And they also, I should add, I'd been part of Claudia's family for 20 years. They all knew what I do for a living. No one had ever thought to mention this. And we were just, we almost couldn't take it in. And I think part of it, the reason that it wasn't spoken of was not that they were trying to hide anything. It was never a secret, because when we asked anyone, they readily answered us. It was that same kind of reticence that you often encounter when people are talking about events to do with, for example, the Second World War. It's not that it's a secret, it's just that it's a painful subject. The entire period is a painful time to talk about. And just talking about it brings back all sorts of memories that people would rather not dwell on. And so I wasn't able to ever, as I say, my mother-in-law wasn't well, my father-in-law had passed away. We weren't able to go back to them and say, what, how, why did we not know this? And so we talked to some of the other aunts and uncles, many of whom live here in Canada, and they confirmed it. Like they had all, even the ones on my on the other side of the family, they'd all grown up in San Zenone. And they said, "Oh yes, the priest. He was the one who asked people to take refugees into their homes, and most people did it." And so by the time we came back to Canada, I was all fired up. I had to find out more. And then life got in the way. I got busy with another book, and I just let it slide. The way so many things, we always say, "Oh, I'm going to sit down with grandma or grandpa and tape their reminiscences," and we never do. And then, one day it's too late. And that happened with my own grandparents. I never got around to interviewing them properly. And it was only when Matthew came to me and said, "Mom, like, are these stories true?" Because he wanted to know, just to know. And I realized I had to find out. And the thing was, it was far easier to find out at least the first part of the story than I would ever have suspected. It took me about a day, and all I had to do was go to the online archives at Yad Vashem, which is the International Center for Holocaust Remembrance in Israel. They have a fantastically detailed online archive that is very easily searchable and yields so much information. And I just typed in the words San Zenone delle Ezzolini, which is the town they were from, and up came the story. And the story, which I'm gonna switch over to pictures in a moment, was true. That there was the parish priest in San Zenone did helped to save dozens and dozens of people during the war. And he did so by having his parishioners hide them in their homes. So now I'm going to switch over to, and let's hope I don't mess this up accidentally. Oh, here we go. Boom, and share. There we go. So there's my husband with he has, yes, with his billy goat goatee as it was then, and that's his Zia Maria. And that was, I think, when we visited them. That picture was taken in 2016. And so she was, there were three sisters in the family, the initially before the war, and then the fourth sister was born after the war. So there was Zia Nora, who's the tallest here. The middle girl is my late mother-in-law, Regina. And the littlest one, looking very suspiciously at the camera, was Zia Maria. And in some ways also too, I find this picture, and in fact, it's in my study on the opposite side of the room. It's an extraordinary an artifact, because they were not how should I put it, just so poor that they couldn't afford anything. But to have a photograph taken, a studio photograph like this, in the late 1930s for their family was no small occasion. And I'm not even, I can't even be sure why they necessarily would have had it done, unless perhaps San Zenone was a very small place. There may have been a traveling portrait photographer who had set up, and then everybody went through and had a picture done. But they're the little girls in their Sunday best, all of them wearing, it's again the same black. It would have been kind of a black velvet dress with the lace collar, the hand crocheted collar on the left. The fact that they all had on fancy little shoes is also quite extraordinary. So that's, within 2 years, Italy had entered the war. It was, as I say, an extremely difficult time, especially in the north of Italy where they were, which was it just became kind of a central point in the conflict, especially in the later years of the war, say from 1943 onwards. But even throughout the war, Mussolini's fascist regime had been collapsing slowly for a number of years, and there were shortages all over Italy. And especially if you're farming families, there were tithes to be made to the government, the amasi. So you were able to keep only very little of what you actually grew and harvested. And the central memory for my late mother-in-law was of being hungry all the time. And that is true of the surviving aunts and uncles. Is just hunger, hunger, hunger. The man that I mentioned earlier, Father Odostoko. This is a picture of him actually when he became a Monsignor in 1948. But and then he left the parish. He was sent elsewhere. But until then, he'd been the parish priest in San Zenone since, I believe, the late 1920s. He was revered. The word revered came up many times in my conversations with people. Absolutely beloved in the community. And he was the one. And I've no one really knows what his ultimate motivation was. You can only surmise that it was just sheer human decency that made him decide to at first start offering shelter to people locally. And there were some Jewish families living locally, and then to people from farther afield. And by the end of the war, he's known to have taken in and found shelter for, or otherwise helped, either by providing forged travel documents, or even just food to people on the run. But more than 50 people. And I suspect, and in fact, the investigators at Yad Vashem also suspect that the number's quite a bit higher. But he never boasted about it. He never talked about what he did after the war. He left no memoir. So it's really only the reminiscences of the people who survived, and the people who were there, who have memories of that time, who were able to put together this incomplete picture of what went on. but basically it was known, and this was true also for people who were partisans who were on the run, who were part of the resistance, who were on the run from the Nazis and fascists, that he would find a way to help you, and because he was such a highly regarded figure, and to a certain degree he was somewhat untouchable. I mean, if he'd been caught red-handed sheltering Jews, he certainly would have been, at the very least, imprisoned, more likely deported. And there are also cases of priests being summarily executed by the Nazis. Um, so around 1943, we believe, Father Stocco came to my grandparents-in-law, and asked them if they would help to shelter people who had to go into hiding. And at that point, it was principally Jewish Italians who had been living in pretty terrible conditions in Italy since about 1938. There were some really noxious anti-Semitic laws that had been passed in 1938 that effectively made it impossible to have any kind of public life. If you were an Italian Jew, you weren't allowed to work for the government. You couldn't go to school. You couldn't practice a profession. You couldn't do things like go to the beach. So things had become, increasingly difficult. But it was only in 1943 when, Mussolini's government collapsed, and then the Nazis effectively, took over much, though not all, of Italy, and an occupation began, that life became just the level of peril increased a thousandfold, because arrests happened almost immediately. People were being deported. No one knew where exactly. They just knew it was far away, and that no one who had been deported ever came back. What we know now is that people were being deported. Um, Typically, they would go to one of the prison camps in the north of Italy, and from there be sent by train to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they were murdered upon arrival at Birkenau. So Father Shoko didn't know that was happening, but he did know that things were dire, and so he offered shelter to dozens and dozens of people in the parish. And so I'll back up a little bit and say that in 2010, he and two families from the parish were named officially righteous among the nations, which is a relatively rare honor. Only about 30,000 people worldwide have received it since the end of the Second World War. And this is for people who are Gentiles, who helped to save the lives of Jews during the war. And the process by which you're named righteous among the nations is a pretty exhaustive one. They need a lot of documentary evidence for a person to be given this honor. But the investigators at Yad Vashem concluded, and there's an official report that you can read if you go to the Yad Vashem website. They concluded that even though they were only able to officially name two local families as officially righteous among the nations, that most of the families in San Zenone were involved to one degree or another. Really, the whole town, it was you could either say is a large village or a small town, but the whole community was in on it. But it was just for lack of documentary evidence. So much time had passed that they weren't able to verify it. Now, that includes my husband's grandparents. I can't prove it. I'll never be able to prove it. And that to a certain degree it's disappointing. That's what I set out to do. I'll just show you now some pictures of them. This is my husband's grandfather, who was known locally as Nani. And my husband knew him as Nono Nani. And he died when Claudio was still a little boy. This is a picture of him in the 1930s, I guess would be the very early 1930s. There he's wearing his Alpini uniform, which was a famed kind of Alpine regiment that when you did your military service, if you're from the north, you'd be part of the Alpini, as was my father-in-law after the war. And the woman to his right is the woman who became his wife, Emma. And then on the left, we think that's his mother and maybe one of his aunts wearing, what is the classic Italian nonna get up. Really. it, there's still actually little old ladies walking around San Zenone wearing almost exactly the same outfits. This picture I really love. This is my parents-in-law on their wedding day. So on the left, the bride is Regina, and above is my late father-in-law Gino, who's one of my favorite people ever. And then you see Giovanni or Nani. In the middle is Anja Rosa, who is the daughter born after the war. And she's the younger one who, helped me a lot from a distance with my research, because I would have questions and she'd go out and get answers for me, and then send me texts. There's nothing like having relatives who are adept with technology. And at the very bottom is Emma, and it's the only picture any of us have in which she's smiling, because like many Italian nonnas, smiling wasn't something she did very often, at least not in pictures. These two pictures I include. These are my parents-in-law on their wedding day. My mother-in-law was a seamstress, very talented seamstress. She's the woman, I should add, to whom I dedicated the gown. And she made her wedding dress herself. My sister-in-law still has it. It's beautiful. It's so tiny. Neither of us were able to fit into it for our wedding days. That's why we didn't wear it. And then this picture is the entire family on the steps of the church in San Zenone. The two priests at the front, you see a young novice, and then behind him is a priest, are my husband's uncles, who actually married us when we got married, just coming up 20 years ago. Nani and Emma are on the bottom left of the photograph. Emma having her typical Italian nonna. She probably thought she was smiling, but that's the expression on her face instead. What's interesting about this church, it's a huge church. It's almost at the size of a basilica, to be honest. It's just enormous. Twice the size of the church I go to in Toronto. It's just enormous. And it's in this tiny little town. And this is the church where Father Stocco was the pastor for many years. And it's quite a lovely church inside. And I will say they still play the bells very regularly, including at 8 a.m. on Sundays, which, of course, is a bit of a rude awakening when you're there for a holiday. And his aunt, Zianja Rosa, lives one block away from the church. So we certainly had our lovely early morning wake up call every day. A few more pictures that I want to show just as I talk about the places that informed me. And then I'll get back. I'll move to the discussion of how the story became the story. This is the house where, still owned by a cousin. Everybody in San Zenone is a cousin. This is the house where my husband's grandparents lived during the war. So they lived there with with Giovanni's mother. His father had died shortly before the war, with one of his brother's wife, his brother's children. I think there were two or three at the time, and then they had four children of their own. In addition to the younger girls, there was one brother who's also still alive. So a lot of people in the house already. And this is a small house. The stable is bigger than the house. The stable to the left, which is now really a drive shed, it's a reconstruction. It was rebuilt at some point in the 1950s or 60s. But the house is pretty much as it was then. You can see on the top floor, there's almost what would be a granary level. Typically, the granaries for these farmhouses were on the top floors. At the time of the war, it had been converted into bedrooms because they were short on space. And you can see there's a metal chimney almost at kind of the center of the picture attached to the house. And just to its left is a window. And this was the window that so when people were sheltering at the house, there was an agreed upon ritual, which is if the police or the local fascists or, God forbid, the Nazis came to the farm, anyone who is sheltering there, who and they were in that room almost all of the time, anyone who is sheltering would, and typically, these visits would come like in the middle of the night. That's the best way to surprise people. They would go out the window and they would press themselves against the roof of the stable, and inside, someone in Claudio's family would pull. There was a big wardrobe, and they would pull it in front of the window so that anyone entering the room would just see the one window on the side, would hopefully not realize that there was another window, and would not think to push aside the wardrobe and look out onto the stable roof, because then they would have found the people who were huddled on the roof. That was the plan. Now, when certainly the police came by pretty often. It was not uncommon to have raids. What was most likely is they were looking for partisans. There were partisans everywhere. They were very close to Monte Grappa. I don't think they were ever raided specifically because the police, the local police, were looking for Jews. But if they had found anyone there and had realized that they were Jewish, that would have been that for Nani, and any of the men in the household. At the very least, they would have been dragged off to prison camp, but more likely they would have been sent to Germany, or Poland, or Austria as forced laborers. And relatively few of those forced laborers came back. So that's the setting. That's the family background and the setting. And as I said early on, I had thought to myself, I was doing this because I wanted to find out the answers about our family for my son, and his sister too, just so I could tell them, this is part of your family history. And I can't. I can't. I wouldn't be able to stand in a court of law and swear to it that this happened, that they were involved. I believe they were. I just can't prove it. And that's really frustrating. And there's part of me that every few weeks I wake up and I think, well, maybe I could look here, maybe I could look there, maybe I could find it out. But I think the truth is that too much time has passed. If I had attempted this 10 or 15 years ago, I might have been successful. But it's just the passage of time is pretty brutal in terms of what it sweeps away. And there was very little documentary evidence to begin with, because only a crazy person would have written down all the details at the time. Certainly Father Stocco was not writing down details of who he was taking in, and where they were. And there's no way you would risk anything like that. And then again, after the war, very few people wrote about it. This is a farming community. People had other things to do rather than sit down and write things out in diaries and memoirs. But people didn't want to think about the war. Why would you want to focus on something so disagreeable? People for many years generally looked forward. So that was a dead end. But I realized, again, this happened very quickly, that it actually, whether or not my family was involved, and whether or not I could prove it, was not the point. The first realization I had was, well, it had happened. Nonetheless, this had happened in San Zenone, that this one man who was an ordinary kind of country priest. He had no pretensions to higher office, really. He wasn't an ambitious man. He would have had a fairly minimal education by the standards of the day, although certainly a much more thorough one than anyone in the village would have had access to. He just did it. I can only surmise out of the goodness of his heart, that he just couldn't bear the thought of innocent people being imprisoned and deported and who knows what. But I suspect he would have had a good idea that it couldn't have been anything good. He couldn't stand the idea of that happening when he was in a position to help. And so, whether or not my family was involved, the truth remains that dozens of people survived, were sheltered, were helped, who survived, who otherwise would likely have perished, and that they went on to have children and grandchildren, and that there are people alive in the world today, who are alive because a handful of people, set against the many who did nothing, but nonetheless, a handful of people chose to do what was right. So that was kind of the first revelation. And then the second big revelation I had was that uh, as much as I was inspired by Father Stocco and the people of San Zenone, what I was really curious about were the people who themselves had to go into hiding. What were their stories? Who were they? And that's when I realized that there was a book in this, and not only a book in this that I could actually, even before I knew her name, I could close my eyes and uh, I had a sense of who my heroine was, the woman who became Nina, or Antonina as her full name. But I felt as if she were familiar to me. And the more I listened, the more she had to say, which I know sounds a little woo woo, but that's the way things work for a lot of writers. And so I set out to find a way to fictionalize this story that I knew imperfectly, and to place her at the center of it. So the places I write about in the book, and I should add, because I obviously some or most of you may not have read the book. I'm not going to give any spoilers away. What I talk about now in terms of events is really just the first quarter of the book. But when we meet Antonina, she's living in Venice, in the family home that has, she talks about the green door that everyone knew to go to, because her father is a physician, a very revered local physician. And even though the number had worn away years ago, everyone knew to knock at the green door, and Dr. Mazin would come and help. And it's a green door because on one of my visits to Venice, when I was walking around the Jewish ghetto, I should add the word ghetto is a Venetian term. It originated in Venice. I found this door, this house, on the edge of a canal, just to the left. You can see the pillars there, but on to the left of it is the water of the Rio del Ghetto. And in fact, if I go back one moment here, I took this, actually, it would just be a year and a bit ago. I was there in January 2020. Last time I got on a plane was to go to Europe. You can see in this picture, if you look kind of to this, there's two white boats on the right side of the canal, and then there's a space and a few more, and then there's lines of washing kind of converging, and you can see a little archway there in the pinkish colored house. That's the archway that's just to the left. And so the house at the very end of the canal, on the right side of the canal, that's a pinkish red, it obviously exists, and that's the house I imagine as Antonina's home. So this, I've walked the streets. I tried to inhale kind of the air, the history there. I visited what is now actually a guest house and restaurant, but at the time was the Casa di Riposo, which was the seniors' residence, and it was kind of for both for seniors who were in good shape, and also people who needed a little bit more care. And that's where Nina's mother is living at the beginning of the story. She's an invalid. She cannot travel. Nina's father will not leave his wife, and that is why Nina ends up alone, going into the countryside with a stranger who is a friend of a friend, to hide in this little village called Mezzocel, which is a product of my imagination. There is a place near San Zanone if you look on a map, called Mezzochel. But when you actually visit Mezzochel, what it is today is a crossroads, and there's a handful of farm buildings, and that's it. Maybe 100 years ago, there may have been a larger village there. But today there's not much there. It just marks the space of an earlier occupation. So I borrowed the name, with the blessing of one of my husband's aunts, who she felt it was a sensible thing to do, because if I set in the story in San Zanone, then people would complain. And it's been translated into Italian, I should add. So, she didn't want anybody calling her up and whining, "Oh, Jennifer got it wrong. This wasn't the name of the street. It was this other name." And so she said, "Let's you make it pretend, and then nobody can complain that you got it wrong." Um, so I'll just show you a few more pictures of the countryside to give you a sense of how I found myself in the how I centered the story in the place. This photograph I call the road to Mezzochel. This is the road that leads north out of San Zenone. The bulk you see in the distance is Monte Grappa itself. Which, as I say, was a battlefield in both the First and Second World Wars, and there are numerous monuments at the summit. And in the middle distance, actually kind of on the hillside before it kind of really becomes very steep, you can see it's still, there's some trees and so on, and there's villages dotting that hillside. And that's where there's a tiny village today called Borso de Grappa, where a number of our cousins live. And so I inserted Mezzochel into a space, just a few hundred meters down the road. And so you can't actually visit Mezzochel, but if you were ever to find yourself in this part of Italy and you went to the village called Borso de Grappa, you would probably look around and find it very familiar, because again, there are places in that village that made it into the book. One of them is the tiny little chiesa. This is much more of a normal village size chiesa. This is it's hard to see how tiny this church actually is, but it's really quite small. I think probably there's enough room for about 60 people inside. And this was my inspiration for the descriptions of the Chiesa Santa Lucia in the book. Across the road from my husband's cousin lives in a beautiful home in Borso de Grappa. And across the road is this ruined farmhouse, which I remember was up for sale the last time we were there. And I looked at Claudio and thought, well, I mean, what's the exchange rate with the euro these days? And alas, it was not one of those properties that was for sale for €1. If it were, then we might have snapped it up. If you can kind of close your eyes and imagine this house complete. And it was built lovingly back in the day. It's a beautiful construction, and it's sad that it's been allowed to fall into disrepair. But this is the countryside. It's incredibly beautiful. Relatively few people, at least from outside Italy, visit this part of the Veneto, even though it's an absolutely gorgeous part of the country. I think a lot of people just tend to go to Venice and maybe as far as Verona or Padua, but they don't venture farther afield, and it's absolutely worth the trip. This is looking down from the hillside to the plain beyond, and then the ridge you see is actually another kind of ridge that sweeps around. So it's actually looking. It's more to the southeast. This photograph. In the very far distance is Venice, which you can't really make out. It was too cloudy that day. But again, this is the farming was difficult. It was hillsides, it was rocky, but they still managed to kind of scratch out a living. And then this photograph is of Bassano, which makes an appearance in the book several times. And it was the nearest. It barely qualified as a city. It's really still very small, but it was the largest kind of really urban center. It was about 15 kilometers away, and it was the kind of place, if you needed something out of the ordinary, then you would hop on your bicycle or walk to go into Bassano. And so these are the, the people, the places. I'm just going to return to the green door here, which I also have to add is, so I have a friend in Venice who is a local historian, an expert on the Jewish ghetto, and Chiara just happened to go by. She was actually in a boat, and she went by not so long ago, and then she texted me and said, "Oh, Jennifer, they've repainted the door." So unfortunately, the green door is no longer green, which I found very disappointing. And they've patched it up. And although, this is what I love about Venice, that it's simultaneously crumbling and falling to pieces and incredibly beautiful at the same time. So that's the story. That's where I begin. I don't want to say too much about what happens later in the book after Nina goes to Mezzocell, apart from the fact that the book is centered on her. It's centered on, her experiences fitting in, hiding in plain sight, which many people had to do, of how perilous and frightening it was. Nonetheless, what I wanted was a heroine. I never want to write a story about a doormat. And so she's brave. She never gives in. She endures what happens to her really unflinchingly. And one more thing I want to say, again, without giving too much away, is that, and I think it's a pretty typical reaction given where we're all, at right now, which is to maybe see a story about the Holocaust and think, I don't know if I have it in me right now to read a book that's going to break my heart. And I will say there are definitely some very tough moments in the book, but it will not break your heart. It will not ruin your day. And the story, more than anything else, is about hope. I wrote it I'd written a first draft, but I finished the book and it became the book it is now. When most of that work happened last March, April, and May. And I needed something hopeful. I could not, if I had written a downer book, I just couldn't have kept going. So that's where the story came from. But it all began with this one question from my son. And it led me to this place called Mezzocell. Now, I'm not sure if we have any questions that have come up. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? Sorry, I'll stop sharing my screen because that doesn't help things at all.
Yeah, so we'll do our best. I think people will,
or even just do a little wave. We're all on the same screen.
We'll say, unmute yourself and
yeah,
we'll get there.
I think Joy is asking.
Joy, do you want to have a question, Joy?
Yes, just a statement.
Yeah.
I looked you up on the machine to find out which book she'd written. That doesn't sound very nice, but I must have written 4 or 5 books without realizing it was you. Okay, and we were going to be interviewing you today.
Yeah.
Everybody in the family read The Gown.
Yeah. Oh, it's not lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of cousins, they were sisters. Did you read The Gown? Another one that's way farther over in Coburg. So it was all of us that, I can't say same age, but we thought that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Because I was so tiny, I was a little girl when Queen Elizabeth, but I was still around, my mom was so steeped in British. She was a British war bride. So she was really steeped in all this stuff about Queen Elizabeth. So I'm going to say goodnight, but I had to stay here and tell you how much.
Thank you. That's lovely. Yeah. Well, did you know tomorrow is William and Kate's 10th wedding anniversary? And I just saw there's some lovely new pictures of them that went up. If you look online, you can see them. And it's been 10 years ago. I I have my moments sometimes with the royal family. I love the Queen. I love the Queen. So did anyone see the picture of her smiling she did a virtual meeting that just maybe I felt kind of relieved when I saw that.
Yeah.
But I had a tea for my closest girlfriends and my sister, and my daughter was then 4. And we had a tea that started at like 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
And we all had whatever was the kind of the decent thing to wear out of the house.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
had the on. We had tea and crumpets and scones, and it was in champagne. It was one of my happiest kind of grown-up memories, was that morning with my friends. So yeah, 10 years, my goodness. But these
Yeah.
royal weddings do have a way of kind of not just marking moments for them, but marking moments for us, I think. And I certainly love remembering.
And it was true what you said in the book about Britain had suffered through the war, and it always seemed so down, and then they had the wedding, and that was just the other side of the coin,
Yeah. Now my next book is about the coronation, or it's actually not about the coronation, I should add, but it is set in the run up to the coronation. It's called Coronation Year, and it's all about what it was like to be living in London, in Britain in 1953, and the hopes that people had. People were talking quite openly in 1953. Is this the dawn of a new Elizabethan age? Will this be the rebirth of Britain? And as we know, the next decades for Britain were I would say somewhat disappointing, at least compared to, say, the resurgence of the United States or Germany, for example. But nonetheless, what I'm interested in doing is, again, capturing the feeling of a time, what it was like to be alive then, the hopes and fears people had. And it's been really fun to dig into London in 1953 and try and imagine myself as a tourist then, walking through the streets. And
my mom
so
and
thank
I
you. That's very kind of you.
Oh, you're welcome. My mom and I went back in 57, and we were out in this very small town in Frome, which is Somerset, and we were also in Bristol, and we were in London, and there were still bomb craters and piles of rubble, and the pea soup.
Well, I live from the terrible pollution. I lived in Britain. I was there. The longest I've lived there is 5 years, from 92 to 97. And there were still bombed out lots of land in London in the early 90s. Now they're long gone. The building craze in London, I mean, I feel like every other street has a huge crane towering over it. But that's how long, so we're talking 50 years. 50 years for it to. Oh, and I see, you know what I'm going to say, I see one of our other guests waving. Is it I just see it says Maurice, but I think actually Pam is more likely to be.
Okay, thank you.
Actually it's Darlene. Pam, I'm on my husband's computer.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, now Jennifer, oddly enough, I've read some of your books, just like the previous person said, without realizing it was you. Now, you seem like a relatively young woman, yet most of
Isn't that lovely of you to say so? I'm 51.
Okay, well, you're young.
That's what I tell myself. Yeah.
And a lot of your books are about the war. So what interested you into, I guess, that time era?
The period.
It's the period.
So it's because my background is an historian. So it's twofold. So I trained as an historian at Oxford. My doctoral thesis turned on issues of rationing during the Second World War. I've always been interested in the Second World War. And I should add, but that predates my being a graduate student and academic, because my father taught the history of World War I and World War II for many, many years. He taught at Trent University in Peterborough for, 30 odd years, closer to 40, I think, actually. And then he did this kind of semi-retirement that didn't stick. And then he moved to Victoria and taught at UVic for a number of years. And now he's fully, officially, completely retired because he's 81. He's earned it. But he still helps me with research, my unpaid research assistant from time to time. And but he just had a passion for it, and it was infectious. And it was always interesting, even when I was a teenager and I hated everything and I was a grump about everything and everything was boring and stupid. I have one of those living in my house right now. So, but I still found it fascinating, both the wars. Initially, it was the Great War, and that's probably why I wrote my first 3 books were centered in the Great War. I discovered the poet Wilfred Owen when I was 15. And if there's no better time to discover, especially if you have a romantic heart, right? I mean, I was smitten. I was just bowled over by that poetry. And then to know that he had died age 26, a week before the war, he was killed, right? I mean, I remember thinking I would never recover from the tragedy of learning that. It just felt like an arrow through my heart. And it's always felt very real to me, in the way that I think on some level you just have to have that what I call myself the history nerd, but either it fascinates you or it doesn't. And I'm not casting value judgments on people who aren't interested. Oh, what a darling little doggy. Hello. Hello. Either you're interested, you're not. And again, not a value judgment, but that it's something that interests me, right? I just find it fascinating. And again, the family history always leads me towards it. My great grandfather was a Passchendaele. My grandfather Reg was a journalist actually during the Second World War, stationed in London. He was an information officer for the RCAF, and lived through the Blitz, and just had extraordinary experiences, which he talked about very little, I should add. And my grandmother, who inspired Good Night from London, was also a journalist, although based in Vancouver at the same time. And so these are things that were just in the air. I feel as if I just breathed it in. And World War II is a really hot, so to speak, period for fiction right now. And some people are saying, oh, I'm getting sick of it and so on, but I just think there's so much to tell. There's so many stories, and we're just beginning to we haven't even come close to kind of exhausting the subject matter. There's so many aspects of history from that war that have still have to be told. I mean, I think, if I never read another novel that centers on the military history, I'll be fine. But I'm really interested, again, what happened to ordinary people, what happened to civilians. Those things are just endlessly fascinating. How people managed, and it as a guidebook for us today on how to manage. It's unimprovable. Every time I start having little whiny moments, and I think we all do, my family is exceptionally privileged and we have not struggled at all. And I would never claim that we had a difficult time at all. Having to order groceries online does not count as difficult, right? Like, there's nothing that's difficult about that. But we all have moments where we feel a little fragile and like, oh, I wish I could do this, I wish I could do that. And then I think of the people in London during the Blitz, month after month after month of uninterrupted bombardments every night, and going into shelters and not being sure if your home would exist when you got up in the morning, or your neighborhood, and going to work anyways. Like, there's no taking a day off because you hadn't slept, right? Like, there's no taking, you're like, oh, I need a week to recover because my nerves are shot. People just went to work, right? Like, climbing over the rubble, and they just did what they had to do. And I find that, again, every time I'm tempted to feel a little woe is me for what are, for me, are completely inconsequential issues. I remember, I think of people then and how resolute they were. And it, and then I feel a little ashamed of myself for whining. which isn't the worst thing in the world,
No, absolutely. My husband, who I will say is older than me, was born in the later years of the war.
Yeah.
In East London, and he remembers playing in like the bombed out shelters and the minefields. That's what they did.
Yeah. One of my mom's cousins, first cousins, grew up in Edinburgh, which was also bombed. Again, we talk about London all the time, but every urban center in England, Scotland, and Wales was bombed. If you're a port city, that was it. You were bombed. A manufacturing center, you were bombed. And he remembered too, like playing in the rubble and then doing things like they would find shell casings and collect them. And shrapnel was like, it was one of these things little boys would collect. And I will say just, and I've just suddenly lost the name of the book of the movie, and it was by John Boorman, and it came out in the late 80s, and I'm going to remember it about 4 a.m, and it's set in London, the suburban London during the war, and it's from the point of view of a little boy, and it is incredibly good. And
I saw that.
Maybe somebody will remember the title. Normally I would start typing on to see what Wikipedia brings up, but it's not Homefront, but it's something. Hope and Glory. Hope and Glory is the name.
It was just Hope and Glory this week.
So actually, if you can look up Hope and Glory, and I think it's available, maybe it's available on one of the streaming things. It has one of the best depictions of ordinary, everyday, kind of lower middle class life in that period. It's incredibly good. It was really well done. I saw it as a teenager. I had no clue that this would be something I'd be studying many years later. But just all the little details are great in it.
It was on this week, believe it or not.
Oh, wow. See, there we go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sometimes TCM or Vision has those kind of movies on.
Yeah, Vision TV quite often has those fun movies. Yeah. So, it's just always been a period of surpassing interest to me. And fortunately enough, my husband is also a history nerd, although he's a civil engineer by profession. So I always have somebody to talk to about these things, who doesn't get bored by me wanting to talk about what happened in World War II.
Oh, well, that was fascinating. Thank you.
I think Mona and then Maya.
Hi. So,
Hi.
Within this last year where we've been more confined than usual, many authors have said, well, when I write, I'm confined anyway, so I'm not really noticing a difference.
No.
But you obviously love to do research. And at what point do you cut it off? Because you can't write a 900-page book every time.
No, as much as, I have moments, my editor would say, no, just for the simple reason it would cost double to publish something that long. If you're George R.R. Martin, your publisher will let you do what you want because people will buy your book no matter what. But ordinary writers we're a little more constrained. With me, with any book, the only reason I stop researching is because I have a deadline and I start to get panicked that if I don't start writing the damn thing, I won't get it done in time. So what I typically do is I do foundational research before I start writing, just so I know the period inside out and I can answer the big questions. And then I start writing, and then that's when the little teeny details that I can't know what to research ahead of time, but that's when they come up. And if I'm in kind of full flow of just typing away and the words are coming, I put placeholders in. Typically I just type in TK, which is a handy placeholder because it doesn't appear in conventional English. The two letters don't appear next to each other anywhere else. And so you can keep going and do a search and replace later. And then I'll just so I'm not tripped up. And then I'll go back that evening to figure out how much did it cost to buy a can of beans, just off the top, like how much was it? I don't know. And, what would it have looked like? And just, I may not even use that information, but I like to know it. So all of that, I mean, it's a long process, and it's typically, there's a point at which I start getting emails from my editors saying, Jennifer, love to know how it's going. Just let me know. And then I start to build, there's a panic thing that builds. And then I am kind of pushed into writing the first draft. And I hate writing the first draft. It's awful because the first draft is terrible. It's just like I have nightmares about it somehow getting out and people reading it and going, my Lord, this is terrible, because of course it is. The first drafts are meant to be terrible. You just have to get it out, and then I'll polish it up. I actually polish quite a bit as I go, but even then it's still terrible. And then I pull myself together. I send it to my editor. I collapse for a few weeks, kind of the whole delicate author collapsing onto my fainting couch. And then my editor comes back with a very, very, very long document outlining what I have to do, big picture, and then also changes within the existing document. And then I go and fix it. And that stage I love, possibly because I was an editor myself a number of years ago. I love the picking it apart and putting it together, which interestingly, for a number of my friends who are writers, that's the agony. What they love is the first draft. I just, for me, the first draft is just, I feel as if I have I'm just fish hooks digging into my brain. It's awful. I mean, I have moments when I'm writing and the words, so many words. This is wonderful. All the words. And then typically what'll happen is I'll hear weird noise, and it's the cat throwing up in the rug, and I've lost the moment. And then I go back and I can't find it again. And it's so frustrating. And that's pretty typical of most writers. Like you just, again, I'm not complaining at all, because life has been very, very easy for my family compared to what so many other people are up against. And I have my sister is, works in a hospital. So I can kind of see the contrast in terms of just stress levels, really. But I do have moments where the one thing that I do miss, and I would love to have, but again, I'm perfectly able to live without, are things like being able to go away, just sit in a friend's cottage, or, splurge in a hotel room, or even just go and sit in a coffee shop and write. Noise doesn't bother me. What I find tough is at home, and we're all at home. Maybe the kids have been at school, doing school from home for most of the year. My husband works in the basement. Everyone talks loudly. So I have these are my Zoom headphones, but I have these huge noise canceling things that a bomb could go off outside the house and I wouldn't hear, that I have to put on when I'm working. And all of those things, I'm being the delicate flower. That's how I manage to find my space. But that's the only thing that I really miss in that sense, is just being able to go and have, a couple of days to myself to just hammer out the words. But where I am constrained this book around, I mean, it actually would have been much more difficult with the travel restrictions. I think I would have found it difficult to write Our Darkest Night without going to Italy a couple of times. Fortunately for Coronation Year that I'm working on now, I mean, I've lived in England. I've been to, I don't know how many times I've been to London. I know the places that I'm going to be writing about, I know really well. And also a British history, and this isn't true of every country or period, but the history of Britain in the kind of the 20th century, the online archives and materials, so much has been digitized that it's fantastically easy to do research without leaving your home. That's not true for every period or every country, obviously, but for me, for my purposes, I'd be hard pressed, even if I could go to England right now, to justify going. I mean, I'd still do it. Honestly, if I could, I'd just be, oh, I have to go. But nobody tell Revenue Canada that I said that, but this is, you know, I can get away with it without doing it, just because I've the place, I'm already familiar with it. But, you know, for people, for writers who want to write about a place they haven't been before, or who really need access to very inaccessible archives. You know, a lot of places, again, they aren't, the contents are digitized. There aren't researchers on site, you know, who can do the work for you. Even, you know, you could offer to pay them as much as you want. They can't do it. A lot of libraries and archives are just closed. So even if, you know, you could go, they're just, you wouldn't be able to go inside. And so I've run into a few places where I haven't been able to track down what I need. And that's when I start thinking, okay, well, what's the workaround? What's the alternate source that can lead me to the information I need? And it all feels like a bit of a detective hunt, which is the fun part, really. I love that part about it. It's almost the nicest part of being an historian is just looking for clues.
I mean, it is fiction, so.
Yeah, and so that's the thing. I mean, on some level, I'm not going to, you know, there's a limit to how far I'm going to chase down the teeny tiny things. And I'm lucky in that I already had a pretty thoroughgoing knowledge of the period in place, just from my academic background. But at the same time, you know, we all can tell, we've all read books. I'm not going to name anybody's book specifically, but we've all read historical fiction where, you know, people, you know, skated across the research part of things. I mean, it might be a really good book otherwise, but it just feels really, really thin. As if it's, I call them the, you know, the wallpapery ones. And those I personally find unsatisfying to read. I really want, if I'm going to dig in, I really want to close my eyes and be able to have a really very all-encompassing sense of the time and place. And you can't cut corners. But there's also ways around, you know, a lot of the roadblocks you run into. And, you know, and I have a, you know, number of, I have actually one online group, which is historical fiction writers, and we're all represented by the same literary agent. And so our group includes, you know, Kate Quinn, Janie Chang, Bryn Turnbull, whose first book came out last year, which was wonderful, called The Woman for Wallace, Chanel Cleaton, Natasha Lester, who's amazing, Stephanie Dre, like a ton of us. And it's been a godsend for all of us because we share tips and tricks. And also it's a place to vent when we've had a bad day or to share good news. But it's amazing, you know, when you hit a wall, just being able to go to a group of like-minded people and say, what do I do? I don't know what to do. And someone always has a solution.
Maya, you still have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Me and my long answers.
No, I think you answered it actually. So thank you. Thank you, Jennifer.
See, if you keep talking, eventually you'll answer
exactly.
all of
I'll answer everything. It'll all be done.
Does anyone else have a question? Wave your hand. Those are good. No.
And there may be people who don't, if your video isn't on, we can't see you waving.
Well, yes, if your video is
That's
not
true.
on, you can be waving all you want, but I can't see you.
Yeah,
so.
We're not ignoring you.
Well, I don't see anything coming up on chat, and that's fine. I think we'll call it an evening.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, first of all, for coming out, joining us tonight, and especially Jennifer Robson. What a pleasure to see you again. And
I hope
next time we see you
next time for
next
Coronation Year. Yeah, Coronation Year comes out tentatively. It's scheduled for January 2023, which I know sounds like super, but you know, it's less than 2 years.
Yes.
And I still haven't finished writing it, so that's one thing. And you know, let's hope that maybe, you know, sometime in 2023 I can make my way down to Niagara. I feel very confident that will happen.